There is a button here, and I sure am tempted to press it. Alright, let's see what happens. Whoa, okay. So it looks like the sky changed to nighttime, the base plate's color changed to pink, and I think the material changed it to neon as well. Hold on, I gotta see what's happening here with the script. Okay, this is a bindable event, it looks like, and it's being fired, but where's this being fired to? I think it's probably in script 2. Yeah, okay, so it's being printed here inside of script 2 when it's catching the event call. But what's weird is that it's only doing one of the things that we saw in the workspace, which was change the lighting. So where else is this being called? So maybe it's in script. Oh, I see. So this is where we're doing the second thing, and I imagine script 4 is when we're doing the other thing. Yeah, okay. So what's interesting is that it's making this fire function one time, but then it's being caught in all of these 3 different scripts that are doing different things. And keep in mind, these are scripts. These are not local scripts to scripts or scripts to local scripts. These are just scripts communicating among all these other different scripts to do different things. Okay, I think I understand this model pretty well. I think we should probably put this into more practical use. Alright, let's think about this for a minute. So if you remember remote events and remote functions, I made a video on this earlier in this guide. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend you watching that first before watching this one, because what we're going to be talking about today kind of branches off from what we're learning about the server and client communication, going back to that sort of stuff. So this is an expansion on that. But anyways, if we remember what remote events did, this basically acts as one-way communication across the server and client model that allows both sides of the game to communicate with each other. And because of this, we're able to do all sorts of things where if we needed the server to do something based on the client or the player in this case, then we would use a remote event to make that communication happen. And if, let's say, we wanted to make that communication happen, but then retrieve information back, known as two-way communication, we would use remote functions. So one important thing to know about with remote events and remote functions is that they both allow us to communicate from the server to the client or the client to the server. And that is something we need to recall and remember from during that video that I talked about these two things. Because knowing this is how we're going to implement what's now known as bindable events and bindable functions, which is what I'm going to be showing you how to do in this video. Now that we understand it, let me give you a brief rundown of what bindable events are. So from what we just said, with remote functions and remote events, they act as communication between the server and the client. But think of bindable events and functions as if they were one-way and two-way communications between the server and the server, or the client and the client. So there's no stepping into from one side of the game to the other side of the game. It's more like if you had a script communicate with another script, or if you had a local script communicate with another local script. That is basically what we would be doing with these bindable events and bindable functions. So if, let's say, you had one of these scripts, like in my previous example, and so with this one fire call, we would catch that in multiple different scripts to then do multiple different things at once. If, let's say, we had multiple scripts that needed to catch the same event and make it do whatever it is that we needed to, then that is pretty much how we would use communication between the server among multiple server scripts. And so that is basically what we would do here. So with this in mind, I'm going to show you an example of how we would use these bindable events inside of our game, apart from the one I just showed you. So in order to start, we first need to add in our bindable event. So much like our remote events, we need a place to put this inside of the game. And ideally, the best place would be replicated storage. So let's hit the plus sign next to replicated storage, and let's add in a bindable event. So this is pretty much what it's going to look like. And we can rename this bindable event to whatever we want to. Just say bindable event. And then what we can do now is create a script in, let's say, server script service. So let's hit the plus sign, include a script in here. And let's make reference to our bindable event by saying local bindable event equals game.replicated storage : wait for child bindable event. So now that we have reference to our bindable event, let's make this first script the script that we're going to use to fire this bindable event. So the way we're going to do this is by simply saying bindable event : fire open and close parentheses. So this is basically how we're going to fire this bindable event so that we can catch it in a different script to make it do what we needed to be able to have this server to server communication, because that's what we're going to do with this example, is to communicate from one server and catch this fire call in another server script in order to do what we wanted to do with this communication that's happening. So if you really think about this, if let's say this was a remote event, this would be equivalent to fire server and fire client. So this fire function is basically the same thing as fire server and fire client, but this time we know that we're communicating from one side of the game, so we don't need to add in this fire server or fire client name to it. We can simply just say fire no matter where we are, whether we're in the server or whether we're in the client, using these bindable events. So that's an important correlation to note there. But now that we have the fire function, let's catch it in a different script. So on the right side, let's rename this script to bindable, and then let's insert a new script here, and let's call this bindable 2. All right, and so now let's copy our reference to the bindable event from the previous script and put it inside of here. So let's drop 2 lines. So now what we're gonna do is catch this fire function call into an event. And the way this is going to be structured, and this is pretty important, bindable event is an instance, it's not an event itself. So the way we're going to get the event is by simply saying bindable event dot event. So this right here is the actual event that we're trying to connect the fire function call to, not the bindable event instance. So that's important to know about. Then what we're going to do is say connect open parentheses function, open and close parentheses, enter. And so now what we can do is just do something random here by saying bindable has been fired. And there we go. That is basically the very basic setup for using bindable events. So let's go into the game, hit test, and hit play so that we can see in the output that we're going to be printing out bindable has been fired. So as soon as we joined into the game, then the output has printed out bindable has been fired, because we were able to take the bindable event and fire this function so that we can pass it into this second script to then do what we needed to do. So we were able to effectively communicate between one server to another server. So this isn't some communication that we're going from the server to the client or the client to the server, but once again, this is either from the server script to another server script or a client script to another client script. So that is basically the structure of how these things work. Another thing we can do is add multiple arguments to this bindable event. Now, here's the interesting thing about bindable events that make it stand out from remote functions and remote events. So you know how when we're specifying fire server and fire client, and we use on server event and on server an on-client event to give us automatic arguments when we pass in these things. So what I'm talking about here is when we're saying on-server event, for instance, and we have the open and close parentheses with player being the first argument by default, we have things like this to worry about. But the interesting thing about bindable events is that we don't have to worry about automatic arguments being thrown into here, because we know exactly what we're trying to fire. We know exactly what we're trying to catch when we're communicating between the server and the server, or the client and the client. So if let's say we had 2 parameters here with num1 and num2, then our arguments here is also just going to be num1 and num2. So whatever number 1 and number 2 is going to be, so let's say 5 and 10, we know exactly what we're going to be passing and what we're going to be catching with this event. We don't have to worry about any implicit arguments that are going to automatically be passed in just randomly. So then what we can do is we can pretty much say print num1, let's say num1 plus num2. That's going to be 15. So if we go into the game now and hit play, then we should see in the output that our result should be 15 after we print bindable has been fired. And there you go. That is basically working as intended too. So that is how you add arguments to these bindable events, and also bindable functions, but we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so now I want to show you something interesting that you may or may not have seen before, and that is handling multiple ambiguous arguments. You might ask what that means. Okay, so I want you to put things into perspective. So up until this point, when we've been writing these event functions, they have a specific number of parameters. And because we have a specific number of parameters, we have a specific number of arguments. So num1 and num2, so we have 5 and 10 when we're actually firing this event. So there's actually a really interesting concept that we can apply to accept as many arguments as we want if, let's say, we had this script, Bindable2, that catches this bindable event, and let's say we had Bindable3 as a whole new different script that can accept as many arguments as we want to then do what we needed to do specifically for these scripts, knowing that we have passed in these multiple different arguments put together. This is what's called ellipsis, according to Roblox. And this is essentially saying that if we pass in as many arguments as we want, like let's say we have 4, 2, and then 9, these are 5 arguments, but this only takes in 2 parameters. The way we can do this is we can delete these parameters and simply type in ... And this is basically saying that we can pass in as many arguments as we want, and it will not break the script. But here's one important thing to note about with ellipsis is that according to Roblox, it's not fully supportive with ellipsis arguments. So we have to do some sort of like hacky alternative to this to be able to make this work for us. So this is how it's going to work. We need to put these arguments inside of a table. So the way this is going to work is let's delete this print statement right here. And let's make a table. Let's say local arguments equals open and close hard brackets, and then inside of here, we're going to put ... And this is basically going to show us all of the arguments put inside of this table. So if we literally wrap this in a for loop, so by saying for I, v in pairs, open and close parentheses, arguments, do, print v, if we go into the game and hit play, what we should see in the output is all of the arguments inside of the output in its own individual line. So as you can see, we have 5, 10, 4, 2, and 9. Those are the exact arguments that were placed inside of here with this fire function call. So we were basically able to take it over here with this ellipsis syntax, and we were able to put this inside of a table to then loop through this table and check out all of the arguments that we have here. This is how you can take in an infinite number of arguments and take whatever arguments you need inside of here to whatever you need the script to do later on. So now let me show you what else we can do with this ellipsis argument with handling all these multiple arguments. If you remember how indexing works, we can basically tell which argument goes in which spot in this table that we now put as arguments. So what we can probably say here is do a check by saying if arguments in hard brackets 1, so this is the first argument inside of the arguments table. So if this is equal to 5, then what we're going to do is say the first argument is 5. So that is basically how we're going to tell that if this first argument is indeed the number 5, then we're going to print whatever is down here. So this is a little conditional we can do to check if the arguments are valid. So what we can do is we can join into the game. Okay, so it seems like it's firing it a bit too fast, so I'm going to add in a task.wait here for 1 second. So now we should be able to see the result happen when we join into the game. All right, and there we go. So it says Bindable has been fired, and also the first argument is 5 indeed, because we passed all of these arguments into a table, and now we're able to tell which argument is which. And so this is very important for argument checking if, let's say, we're passing multiple different arguments at once and catching them all inside of these different scripts. So now that we've dealt with bindable events, I'm going to show you how to use bindable functions, which I guess we can call this the last of the big 4, which are remote events, remote functions, bindable events, and bindable functions. So if you were to imagine bindable functions, they are pretty similar to remote functions, except in this case, it's a two-way communication from server to the server or client to the client. It's not two-way communication from server to the client to the server and then client to the server to the client. So you kind of get the idea there. It's structured in a way how it's like bindable events, but you take the function part of remote functions, except it's now two-way communication among one side of the game. So for instance, I'm going to show you an example of connecting from one script to another script and then back to the first script using a bindable function. So I'm going to show you how to do this. So on the right side, let's go to replicated storage and let's add in a bindable function, and this is basically what it's going to look like. So we're going to call this Bindable Function. And now what we're going to do is go into our first bindable script, and we're going to make reference to our bindable function. So we're going to say local bindable function equals game.replicated storage wait for child open and close parentheses bindable function. So now we have our bindable function. We're going to copy this reference and paste it into our bindable2 script as well. So now let's go back to our first bindable script. Okay, so now that we have reference to our bindable function, how does this work when we're actually going to communicate to the second server and then go back to the first one? So this pretty much works similar to how remote functions work, and how if we wanted to fire a function and then retrieve information back from the second way communication, we would basically put this inside of a local variable. So we can do the same thing here by saying local, let's just say result equals, and then what we're going to do is we're going to say bindable function invoke open and close parentheses. And much like the fire bindable event function, we just simply say fire. We chop off the server and client related part, and we simply just say fire, and we simply just say invoke. This is all we need to say if we're either going from server to server to server or client to client to client. So that's basically what we're going to do here. So this is going to invoke our catch over here inside of our second bindable script. So down here, what we're going to do is we're going to say bindable function dot on invoke. So it's just going to be on invoke, not on server invoke or on client invoke. We could just chop those parts off. What we're going to say now is equals function open and close parentheses enter, because as you know, this is how the syntax works if we're doing on invoke or on server invoke or on client invoke or anything like that. So then what we can do is just simply return a value of whatever the heck, it doesn't really matter. We'll just say return success. That's what we're going to say here. So then we're going to go back to our bindable script, and let's print out our result with respect to our invoke call. Okay, and that's basically the syntax here. So it's very similar to using remote functions, except in this case, we're communicating from one server to another server and then back to another server, and not going from this transition from this hop from server to client when we're doing it. So it's basically the same thing. So now we can go into the game and see this for ourselves. So if we hit run, or if we hit play, then we should see that in the output, it says that it printed success, just like expected, because we got our bindable function, we called invoke, and then we went to our second script, and then we basically said on invoke, we wanted to return success if that was the case, and then we were able to print our result successfully. So if, let's say, we were passing in arguments in this case, rather than just having it be a blank invoke call, we can pass in arguments by saying, I don't know, two numbers, 2 and 4 this time. So now if we go into our bindable2 script, we can pass these two in as different parameters by saying num1 and num2. And so what we could probably do in this case is make this an adder by basically adding these two numbers together. So we can just return num1 plus num2. So this adds the two numbers together and returns it as a result. So now we can basically go into the game and see this change for ourselves as well. This is like another thing we can do with this bindable event. All right, and so in the output, we basically printed out 6 because 2 plus 4 is indeed 6. When we passed in these two numbers, brought it into bindable 2, it caught it over here, and then it returned the addition of these two numbers back into here, and then we printed it as the result. So that is basically how you use bindable functions and passing in arguments into here so we can return it back if we need the result. So very similar to bindable functions, except it's communicating from one part of the game. Now you might ask, what's the difference between these bindables versus module scripts? So let's say I was back into the game and I created a module script inside of here in replicated storage. So module script, and let's say with function module.myFunction, open and close parentheses, enter, and then just like do something random. So you might ask, like, if we had this instead of using a bindable event, it basically does the same thing, because if we're firing this function to then do something different, we can effectively do stuff in a different script if we decide to call a customized event. But in a module script, it's kind of the same thing. If we had a script that, let's say, required this module, and we basically just said module.function, it would do something in a different script and not inside of the same script. So there is a distinction between the two that a module script cannot do that a bindable event can, or a bindable function in this case. A bindable event can catch one fire event for multiple different scripts, but a module script, you can only call this one time in a specific module that's basically used more for code reusability and less to do with script to script communication, because when it comes to that specifically, bindable events are a lot more powerful because you can use multiple scripts that catch the same fire call in comparison to a module script that you can only just call once inside of a specific command, and then it would just do what it needs to do inside of here. So that is an important distinction between using module scripts versus bindable events that I think you should take into consideration when choosing which one to use inside of your Roblox game. So in summary, the bindables allow us to communicate from one part of the game within different scripts of that same part, of that same side of the game, rather than before when we used to use remote events and remote functions that allowed us to go from the server to the client and then back to the server, or just simply one-way communication of the server to the client or client to the server. So that is basically the idea of what we used remote events and remote functions before in the past. But now what we can do is do it completely different with bindable events and bindable functions that basically allow us to do one-way and two-way communication in the same side of the server. So if we were to, let's say, communicate from one server to then another server, then that's how we would use bindable events. Or if we wanted to do from one server to another server and then back to the same server, then we would do bindable events yet again. Then we would do bindable functions in this case for two-way communication. So I want you to just take note of this and practice as much as you can, just applying these four different instances of the server and client or one side of the game communication, because when you actually do understand the difference between all four of these and you can successfully use them in your Roblox games, that's when you know that you have understood this concept very well. And these are pretty important to use because technically you can go through without using these in your Roblox game, especially the bindable events and bindable functions, but they can definitely help you out so much in the long run. So I expect you to understand how these work and how you can apply them, because these will definitely save you a lot in the long run. But with that being said, once again, if you're still confused about this concept and you don't really understand so much about the server and client model, then I encourage you to watch my remote events video that I go into great detail about, that basically talks about stuff that we talked about here, but in a more simpler detail. So go ahead and watch that if you haven't already. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care.